Somebody I didn't know, I was reading my book and, this, man, attacked me.
One quiet night inside a royal estate, something vanished without a trace. No alarms, no witnesses, only silence, and a secret the palace refused to acknowledge. Until the guards arrived and everything changed. Vault fell silent. There are moments in royal history that arrive with trumpets, ceremony, and the unmistakable weight of tradition. And then there are moments that unfold in complete silence. No warning, no witnesses, no immediate explanation. This was one of those moments. It began on a cold evening in early 2025, when the quiet rhythms of a private royal estate continued, exactly as they always had. Staff moved with practiced discretion. Lights dimmed at their appointed hours. Security systems remained active but unobtrusive, blending into the background of a place that had long been considered untouchable. On the surface, nothing was out of place, but beneath that calm, something had already shifted. Deep within the estate, behind reinforced doors and carefully controlled access points, lay a secure chamber known only to a select few. It was not a public vault. It was not part of any exhibition or ceremonial display. This was a private holding space, a location reserved for items too sensitive, too valuable, or too historically significant to be handled casually. Among those items were pieces connected to the late Queen, jewelry that had witnessed decades of history, pieces worn during state occasions, diplomatic meetings, and moments that defined an entire era of monarchy. Each one cataloged, documented, and placed with precision, each one part of a system that had functioned flawlessly for generations. Nothing in that room was ever left unaccounted for, until now. The discovery did not happen in the middle of the night. There was no dramatic alarm, no sudden lockdown, no visible sign of crisis. Instead, it came days later, during what should have been a routine internal inventory, a quiet process, a standard check, the kind of task that rarely produces surprises, but this time, it did. According to those familiar with the situation, the moment of realization was subtle at first. A pause, a second look, a quiet recheck of records against physical placement, then another. Because something wasn't aligning. At least one item, possibly more, was not where it was supposed to be. There were no signs of disturbance, no indication that anything had been forced open or mishandled. The surrounding pieces remained exactly as they had been left. The environment itself showed no evidence of intrusion, and yet, the absence was undeniable. What makes this moment so difficult to fully grasp is the nature of the system in place. Royal inventories are not casual records. They are maintained with extraordinary care, often cross-checked through multiple layers of documentation. Movement of any item, no matter how small, is logged, authorized, and verified. Nothing simply disappears, and yet, something had. At first, the response was cautious. No one jumps to conclusions in a royal household. Procedures exist for a reason. Records were reviewed again. Staff movements during the relevant period were quietly examined. Access permissions were re-evaluated. Every possible explanation that did not involve something more serious was considered first. Misplacement, clerical error, temporary relocation for cleaning or assessment. But one by one, those possibilities began to fall away. Because the deeper the review went, the clearer one fact became. There was no record of movement, no authorization, no explanation. The item or items had not been signed out, transferred, or even flagged for inspection. According to every available record, they should have been exactly where they had always been. But they were not, and that is when the tone began to change. What had started as a quiet discrepancy slowly transformed into something far more serious. Not openly, not publicly, but within the small circle of individuals responsible for maintaining the integrity of the royal collection. Because this was not just about value, it was about trust. The estate itself added another layer of complexity. This was not a high-traffic royal residence. It was private, controlled, and deeply personal to Queen Camilla. A place where access was limited not just by protocol, but by familiarity. The people who moved through these spaces were known, vetted, trusted, which made the situation even more difficult to explain. If there had been no external breach, then the question became unavoidable. How could something vanish from within? As the realization settled in, the atmosphere reportedly shifted in subtle but unmistakable ways. Conversations became more measured, reviews more thorough. The usual rhythm of the estate continued, but beneath it, a quiet tension began to grow, because everyone understood what this meant. If even one piece connected to the late Queen's legacy could not be accounted for, then the system itself had been challenged. And in a world built on precision, control, and continuity, that kind of challenge is not taken lightly. By the time the full scope of the situation began to take shape, one thing was already clear. This would not remain a simple internal matter. Something had gone missing, and the silence surrounding it was only just beginning. A legacy too valuable to lose. To understand why the disappearance of even a single royal item would trigger such quiet urgency behind palace walls, you have to understand what these pieces truly represent. This is not simply about wealth, gemstones, or craftsmanship. Royal jewelry exists in a category far removed from ordinary luxury. It is history, preserved in physical form. It is continuity, passed from one reign to the next. And perhaps most importantly, it is identity. For centuries, the British monarchy has used jewelry not only as adornment, but as a language. Every brooch, every necklace, every tiara carries meaning. Some pieces mark alliances between nations. Others commemorate marriages, coronations, or moments of national significance. Many have been worn by multiple generations of royal women, each appearance adding another layer to their story. These are not objects that sit quietly in storage. They are woven into the very fabric of the monarchy's public image. Among the most significant of these pieces are those associated with the late Queen Elizabeth II. Her reign, which spanned more than 70 years, was defined by consistency, discipline, and an almost unmatched attention to detail. That same precision extended to her personal collection. Items were cataloged meticulously, their movements tracked, their conditions are monitored. Nothing was ever left uncertain. In many ways, the structure surrounding her collection reflected the structure of her reign itself. That is why the idea of anything connected to her legacy being unaccounted for carries such weight. It is not simply a break in inventory. It is a break in a system that has functioned without visible flaw for decades. And within royal circles, systems are everything. They ensure order, protect reputation, and maintain the illusion of absolute control. But there is another layer to this story, one that makes the situation even more complex. Not all royal jewelry is owned in the same way. To an outside observer, it may seem as though everything belongs to the crown as a single entity. In reality, ownership is far more nuanced. Some pieces are part of the crown jewels, held in trust for the nation. Others are privately owned by the monarch. Some are inherited directly, while others are loaned, gifted, or placed within a shared royal collection. This distinction matters, because when an item goes missing, determining its ownership becomes critical. If it belongs to the crown, the implications extend beyond the royal family into matters of national heritage. If it is privately owned, the situation remains deeply serious, but is handled within a more controlled internal framework. In either case, the disappearance of such an item is not something that can be dismissed or quietly overlooked. What makes this particular situation even more sensitive is the emotional connection tied to these pieces. Jewelry associated with Queen Elizabeth II is not just historically valuable, it is personally significant to the current royal family. These are items that were part of her daily life, her public image, and her private moments. They carry memories, not just monetary worth. For King Charles, who inherited both the responsibilities and the private assets of his mother, following her passing in September 2022, the preservation of that legacy is not optional. It is a duty, one that extends beyond ceremonial obligation into something far more personal. Protecting what she left behind is, in many ways, an extension of honoring her life. And then there is the matter of perception. The British monarchy operates under constant observation. Every action, every decision, every detail is analyzed by the public, the media, and observers around the world. Stability is not just expected, it is required. The idea that something as significant as royal jewelry could go missing, even temporarily, introduces a level of uncertainty that the institution works tirelessly to avoid. Because once questions begin, they rarely remain contained. If an item can disappear, how did it happen? Who had access? Was it a mistake, a misunderstanding, or something more deliberate. Each question leads to another, and each answer, or lack of one, shapes the narrative in ways that are difficult to control. This is why the situation could not remain a quiet internal concern for long. The longer the absence remained unexplained, the greater the risk that it would evolve into something far more damaging. Not necessarily because of what was missing, but because of what it suggested. A system that could fail, a structure that might not be as impenetrable as it appears. And within a family where image and reality must align as closely as possible, that suggestion alone is enough to trigger action. As internal discussions reportedly intensified, the tone shifted from cautious review to decisive planning. This was no longer about confirming a discrepancy. It was about resolving it, quickly, quietly, and completely. Because in the world of royalty, some things are simply too valuable to lose. Not just in terms of material worth, but in what they represent. And once that line is crossed, even briefly, the consequences can extend far beyond a single missing piece. Inside Camilla's private estate. To the outside world, royal residences are often defined by grandeur, ceremony, and carefully curated appearances. Towering gates, sweeping gardens, historic architecture, each element designed to project continuity and quiet authority. But behind those familiar images lies a different reality, one shaped not by public expectation, but by private routine. Queen Camilla's private estate exists within that quieter world. Unlike the more recognizable royal properties that host state visits and ceremonial events, this estate has long been regarded as a retreat, a place removed from the relentless rhythm of public duty. Here, the pace is slower, the atmosphere more personal, the structure of daily life less rigid, though never entirely free from the expectations that come with royal status. It is, in many ways, a space built on trust. Access to the estate is tightly controlled, but not in the same visible manner as larger royal residences. There are no constant processions of officials, no steady stream of visitors, no need for overt displays of security. Instead, the system relies on familiarity. Staff who have served for years, sometimes decades. Individuals whose presence is not questioned because it has always been consistent. That consistency is what gives the estate its sense of calm. But it is also what makes any disruption within it so deeply unsettling. Inside the estate, daily operations follow a quiet precision. Staff move through their responsibilities with minimal visibility. Schedules are maintained, but rarely announced. Rooms are prepared, maintained, and secured without drawing attention. It is a system designed to function smoothly in the background, allowing life within the estate to feel almost ordinary. Almost. Because even in its privacy, the estate holds items of extraordinary significance. Certain rooms remain off limits to all but a select few. Storage areas are secured not just physically, but procedurally. Access is granted based on clearance levels that are rarely discussed openly. These are not spaces one simply enters. They are spaces one is permitted into, and only under specific conditions. It is within this controlled environment that the missing items were last known to be held, which raises a question that those inside the palace could not ignore. How does something disappear from a place like this? There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of tampering, no indication that the estate's external defenses had been compromised in any way. From a security standpoint, everything appeared intact. And yet, something was no longer where it should have been. As internal reviews began, attention naturally turned inward, not out of suspicion, but out of necessity. When external explanations fail, the focus shifts to internal processes. Access logs were examined with care, staff schedules reviewed in detail. Every individual who had been present within the estate during the relevant time frame was quietly accounted for. But the deeper the review went, the more complicated the situation became. Because nothing stood out, no unusual entries, no unexplained movements, no deviations from routine that could easily explain what had occurred. The system, on paper, had functioned exactly as it was designed to, which left one uncomfortable possibility, that the system itself had been bypassed without leaving a trace. For those responsible for maintaining order within the estate, this was perhaps the most troubling outcome of all. Not because it pointed to a clear cause, but because it did not. A clear cause can be addressed. It can be corrected, contained, and prevented from happening again. But an absence of explanation creates uncertainty, and uncertainty within a structure built on control is difficult to manage. The estate's very nature began to work against it. Its privacy, once considered a strength, now complicated the investigation. Fewer people meant fewer variables, but it also meant fewer possibilities for error. Every individual within the system was known. Every role understood. There were no unknown factors to easily account for what had happened, which meant the answer, whatever it was, had to exist within the known. That realization brought with it a quiet but undeniable tension, because questioning the system meant questioning the people within it. And in a royal household, where loyalty and discretion are not just expected but required, that is not something done lightly. Still, the situation demanded it. As discussions continued behind closed doors, it became increasingly clear that routine review would not be enough. The estate, for all its calm and control, had become the center of something far more serious than a simple discrepancy. It had become the focal point of a problem that refused to explain itself. And in that moment, the perception of the estate began to shift. No longer just a private retreat, removed from the pressures of public life, but a place where something unexpected had occurred, something that challenged the very systems designed to prevent it. And as that realization settled in, one conclusion became unavoidable. Whatever had happened inside these walls could not remain contained within them for much longer. The raid that shook the palace walls. There are lines within the royal household that are rarely crossed. Quiet boundaries that separate routine oversight from something far more serious. Most issues are handled internally, resolved through layers of protocol designed to maintain both order and discretion. Problems are contained, addressed behind closed doors, and rarely allowed to escalate beyond a controlled circle. But when those systems fail to produce answers, the response changes. And that is exactly what happened here. By the time the internal reviews had run their course, one reality had become impossible to ignore. The missing items could not be explained through clerical error, routine movement, or simple oversight. Every record had been checked, every plausible scenario considered, and still the absence remained. At that point, the situation crossed an invisible threshold. This was no longer a matter of internal uncertainty. It was a matter requiring intervention. According to sources familiar with Relied's royal security procedures, the decision to escalate was not made lightly. Bringing in royal guards for a targeted operation within a private estate is not standard practice. It signals a level of concern that goes beyond routine protocol. It suggests that whatever has occurred may involve factors that internal systems alone cannot fully address. And once that decision was made, everything moved quickly. The timing was deliberate. Early morning before the estate had fully come to life. A moment when visibility was low, and the number of individuals present could be kept to an absolute minimum. There would be no announcements, no visible disruption, no indication to the outside world that anything unusual was taking place. But inside, the atmosphere shifted immediately. The arrival of the guards did not come with noise or spectacle. There were no raised voices, no visible displays of urgency. Instead, there was precision, controlled movement, a quiet authority that made it clear this was not a routine presence. They were not there to observe. They were there to act. Access was granted to areas that, under normal circumstances, would remain tightly restricted. Storage rooms were opened, secured compartments examined, documentation reviewed alongside physical verification in real time. Every step followed a structured process, designed to eliminate uncertainty and establish clarity. What makes this moment so significant is not just the presence of the guards, but what that presence represents. Royal estates are built on trust. Systems are designed to function without the need for external enforcement. The introduction of a more direct investigative approach signals that trust has, at least temporarily, been placed under strain. And yet, the operation itself remained controlled. There was no chaos, no sense of panic. Each action was deliberate, guided by procedure rather than emotion. The goal was not to assign blame, but to locate answers, to determine what had happened, and to do so with as little disruption as possible. Still, for those within the estate, the impact was impossible to ignore. The familiar rhythm of the household had been interrupted, not visibly, not in a way that would attract outside attention, but internally, the shift was unmistakable. Conversations became quieter, movements are more measured. The presence of the guards, however discreet, altered the atmosphere, because everyone understood what it meant. This was no longer a question of whether something had gone wrong. It was a question of how far that problem extended. As the search continued, attention focused on the areas most closely connected to the missing items. Locations where access had been limited, where records showed no irregularities, and where, under normal circumstances, there would be no reason to suspect any issue at all. And yet, those were the very places now under scrutiny. Time, in moments like this, moves differently. What may have lasted only a few hours likely felt much longer to those involved. Every detail mattered. Every finding, no matter how small, contributed to a larger picture that was still forming. Then, according to those familiar with the situation, something shifted, not dramatically, not in a way that immediately resolved everything, but enough to change the direction of the operation, because the search, which had begun with uncertainty, was beginning to produce results. Exactly what was found remains unclear. Details have not been officially confirmed, and those with direct knowledge have remained notably silent. But the tone surrounding the operation reportedly changed. The sense of open-ended searching gave way to something more focused, more certain, and perhaps more complicated than initially expected. Because finding something does not always simplify a situation. Sometimes it raises even more questions. Questions about how it got there, why it had been moved, and whether what was discovered represented the full story or only part of it. By the time the operation concluded, the estate had returned to its outward calm. The guards departed as quietly as they had arrived. No public record of their presence, no visible sign that anything unusual had taken place. But inside, the impact remained. Because once a line like this has been crossed, it cannot simply be undone. The systems may return to normal, the routines may resume, but the awareness of what happened lingers. A quiet reminder that even within the most controlled environments, certainty is never absolute. And whatever the guards had uncovered, one thing was already clear. The situation was far from over. What the guards allegedly found. By the time the operation inside the estate reached its final stages, the atmosphere had shifted from uncertainty to something far more complex. The question was no longer simply whether something had gone missing. It had become a question of what exactly had been uncovered. As expected, no official report was released. Within royal structures, findings of this nature are rarely made public in full detail. Information is contained, conclusions are carefully framed, and only what is absolutely necessary ever reaches beyond internal circles. But despite that silence, fragments of information began to surface through those familiar with the situation. And those fragments painted a picture that was anything but straightforward. According to multiple accounts, at least some of the items initially believed to be missing were located within the estate itself, not hidden in a dramatic sense, not concealed behind elaborate measures, but simply not where records indicated they should be. Their presence, while reassuring on one level, introduced a different kind of problem. Because if the items had never truly left the estate, then the issue was not disappearance. It was movement without documentation. In a system where every transfer is meant to be recorded, authorized, and verified, that kind of gap is deeply significant. It suggests that something occurred outside the established structure. Whether intentional or accidental, it represents a breakdown in process. And in a royal context, process is everything. But the situation did not end there. Other reports suggest that not every item was immediately accounted for. That while certain pieces were recovered, questions remained about others. Uncertainty, even in small amounts, carries weight within an institution built on precision. It leaves room for interpretation. And where interpretation exists, so does speculation. Was this a case of internal mismanagement? A misunderstanding between departments? Or something more deliberate, carried out in a way that avoided detection? No single answer has been confirmed. What complicates matters further is the nature of access within the estate. The areas in question were not open to general staff. Entry was limited to a small number of individuals, each operating within clearly defined roles. That level of restriction narrows the field of possibility, but it also intensifies the implications. Because the fewer the possibilities, the more significant each one becomes. Some insiders have suggested that the discovery may have pointed toward procedural lapses rather than intentional wrongdoing. Those items could have been moved for legitimate reasons, but without proper documentation. In an environment where multiple responsibilities overlap, even small communication failures can lead to larger discrepancies. But even that explanation raises concerns, because if something as significant as royal jewelry can be relocated without being properly recorded, it challenges the assumption that the system is as controlled as it appears. And that is not a small issue. The guard's role in the end was not to assign blame, but to establish clarity, to locate what could be found, verify what could be confirmed, and ensure that whatever gaps existed were understood as fully as possible. Whether they achieved complete resolution remains unclear. What is clear is that the operation did not produce a simple outcome. It produced answers, yes, but it also produced new questions. And in a system where certainty is expected, even a few unanswered questions can carry lasting consequences: power, silence, and the royal fallout. In the days that followed the operation, something unusual happened. Nothing was said. No official statement addressed the situation. No clarification was offered. No acknowledgement, even in the most carefully worded form, reached the public. The estate returned to its quiet routine, and from the outside, everything appeared unchanged. But within the palace, silence is rarely empty. It is deliberate. And often, it speaks louder than any announcement. Behind closed doors, discussions were reportedly already underway. Not about what had happened, that had been examined, but about what it meant. Because in a structure as carefully maintained as the royal household, meaning carries weight far beyond the immediate issue. This was not just about missing items. It was about the integrity of the system. Questions surrounding access, documentation, and oversight would have been impossible to ignore. Procedures that had long been taken for granted were likely reviewed with new urgency. Not because they had completely failed, but because they had shown vulnerability. And vulnerability, even in small amounts, is something the monarchy works hard to eliminate. There is also the matter of internal relationships. Trust is a foundational element within any royal household. Staff operate in close proximity to the most private aspects of royal life. Discretion is not optional, it is expected. Loyalty is not assumed, it is required. When a situation arises that challenges that trust, even indirectly, it can have a quiet but lasting impact. Not necessarily through confrontation, but through caution, through closer oversight, through a subtle shift in how responsibilities are managed. For Queen Camilla, the situation carries its own layer of complexity. The estate in question is not just a workplace, it is a personal space, a place associated with comfort, familiarity, and control. To have that space become the focus of such an operation, even temporarily, changes its meaning. It introduces a level of scrutiny that was not there before. And while nothing has been publicly stated, such moments do not pass without reflection. Then there is the broader picture. The British monarchy exists in a delicate balance between tradition and perception. Stability is not just an internal goal, it is a public expectation. Events that suggest disruption, even if resolved quickly, can influence how that stability is viewed. That is why silence is often chosen, not to avoid the issue but to contain it, to prevent speculation from growing beyond what can be managed. But silence has its limits, because in the absence of information, interpretation fills the space. And interpretation can take many forms. Some will see this as a contained internal matter, resolved through proper channels. Others may view it as a sign that even the most structured systems are not immune to error. Both perspectives exist simultaneously, shaped by what is known and what remains uncertain. In the end, the true impact of what happened may not be defined by the missing items themselves, but by the questions they leave behind. Questions about control, about trust, about how an institution built on centuries of precision responds when that precision is tested. Because in the world of royalty, where image and reality must remain closely aligned, even a brief moment of uncertainty can cast a long shadow. And sometimes, the most powerful consequences are the ones that unfold quietly long after the immediate situation has passed.